Thank you. So our next speaker, as Kevin mentioned, Rich Moss, is the director of the Heights Forum and director of admissions at the Heights School in Potomac, Maryland. And as he said, Rich is a dear old friend of mine. I worked with him for 8 years there at the Heights, and we've done some podcasts together, if I can get away with that. Rich earned his bachelor's and law degrees at both magna cum laude from the University of Notre Dame in 2005 and 2008. Prior to returning to the Heights, where he had gone to high school, to lead its admissions office in 2010, Rich was an associate attorney in the energy and trial practice groups at Jones Day Law Firm in Washington, D.C. Rich graduated from the Heights in 2001, and as we mentioned, is host of Heightscast, the heightsforum.org podcast, which is now up over 100 episodes and has topics, covers a range of topics on the formation of boys and men and education. In addition to his outreach work, Rich teaches U.S. politics and government in the Heights Upper School. So join me in welcoming Rich Moss.
Thank you very much, Lionel. Thank you, Kevin, as well, for this delightful invitation. The Center for Constitutional Liberty. Thank you, Sadie, the Herzog Foundation, and to the staff, faculty at Benedictine College. The food has been delicious. All the ships are running on time, and there's a lot that goes into making this happen. So, Paul, I see you in the back. Thanks to everybody. My background, I'm going to speak to you primarily as a teacher. I've done a few different things. Of course, as teachers, we all know that sometimes you lead camping trips, and sometimes you clean up messes, and sometimes you drive buses. But a lot of our work is in the classroom, and so that's the experience that I'm going to lean on today. I've been teaching government to 16, 17, and 18-year-olds for probably about 10 years now. Before that, I taught 5th grade American history, and those are great classes about the age of exploration and Cortez and Montezuma and Vasco da Gama and all that good stuff. But I've been very blessed to see just the arc of the education. The young guys who come in through the admissions office in the 3rd grade, they apply as 7-year-olds, they enroll as 8-year-olds, and they graduate at 18, and they go off. And now some of the guys that I've been very blessed to teach, and Lionel as well, they are now alums who are doing beautiful things. They're presidents of student bodies in colleges. They are running for political office. They are attorneys. They are doing, staff things on Capitol Hill. It's shocking where a lot of our laws really come from. Oftentimes some pretty young guys with great intentions, and gals. We have a young alumnus who's actually the member of his university's board of trustees. So I think I am part of a tradition that I'm very proud of at the Heights, and I'm excited to share that with you. I think it is a tradition that has been successful in fostering in its students a sense of civic responsibility, which is the topic of this conference, and I think it's a great topic. A couple of very brief caveats before I begin my substantive comments. One, I am very much used to the classroom, so if I start wandering away from the microphone, just call me back. If I see anybody dozing off, forgive me if I instinctively assign push-ups. I'll try not to do that. I will undoubtedly, at some point, just talk about our boys, and that's just a habit. Obviously, as a father of 4 daughters as well, I want both groups to be extremely well educated because they both need each other to be fully who they are. And of course, eating is very welcome and drinking during this class. I also will approach this topic and this conversation with a great deal of humility. I'm here to just share some of the things that I've found in my own practice in my classroom. But I know, I really do think of myself a little bit like a farmer, and I think of my admissions work that way because we seed and we harvest. And I also think about my work in the classroom in that way. I'm very much a farmer. And all of you who are in the classroom, I can't pretend to tell you how to deal with your soil, how to work with your crop, how to work with your climate. So these are just ideas that have worked for me and for our tradition at the Heights, but I know it's not going to be the same everywhere, and I think that's the beautiful thing about subsidiarity in this country. I will begin this presentation as I would probably begin most classes I like starting my US Gov classes every single day with an article from the Wall Street Journal or from The Economist. And so, there's times where I could walk into class and I can say, okay, today we're going to talk about district courts, or we're going to talk about the legislative process. But instead, I will do something like this. I think it was yesterday. There was a gentleman by the name of Ismael El Mayo Zambada, who was arraigned in federal district court in El Paso, Texas. And this is one of the top cartel leaders of a cartel in Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel. They have imported close to 2 tons of cocaine into the United States. They've sent unbelievable amounts of fentanyl across our border that have just caused a lot of grief and a lot of damage. He was tricked by a colleague into getting on a plane on the pretense of just visiting some of these clandestine airfields in northern Mexico. And so he gets on this plane thinking he's just going to go and visit some of his airfields, and instead they just keep going north right across the border into El Paso, and he is arrested on the tarmac. He has pled not guilty. If I'm talking to my boys, my guys in class, I might use this as the launching point for a conversation. There's so many ways you can take this. Why did we have to bring this person who's just worked incredibly grave evil? Why did we have to bring him into the United States? Why couldn't he just be arrested in Mexico? Now that we have him here, I mean, we all know he did it, right? I mean, why do we have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt? That's a lot of work. Is that really what we want, right? In the scales of justice, do you really want the scales of justice to kind of tip towards this guy who sent 2 tons of coke into the U.S.? Why is the rule of law kind of different in Mexico? Why is our culture here a bit different, at least at this point in time? Why is rule of law kind of assumed in a way that it might not be there? And we can pray for the rule of law to be preserved here and gained there. How about the laws that are used to prosecute them? Where did those come from? Why were they made? Why are they using racketeering laws that were made in like the 1940s or something to prosecute this drug dealer from today? How do laws come to be? How are they made? Why are they federal laws and not state laws? And why is he being prosecuted in federal court and not state court? What is up with our culture? It's great that we have this respect for rule of law. That's excellent. But why are so many Americans needing these substances to escape from their lives? What's wrong with our own culture? How can we make it better? All of these questions, I mean, and even more deeper questions. Why is Texas a state, right? Why does Texas even belong in the United States? How did that happen? All of this belongs to the civic education that we're going to talk about today, civic education in Catholic schools. And I start with a story because I really do believe that at the end of the day, stories are 90% of what our students will remember. They're going to forget almost everything that we put on the whiteboard, but they will remember the stories, and they will remember the feeling of being loved and affirmed by their teachers. So if you remember one thing, just remember that. So I'll start with a Yogi Berra quote, famous philosopher. He says, if you don't know where you're going, you're probably not going to get there. So I will just a brief overview of what we'll talk about today. We'll begin with some definitions, mainly of education and civic education in particular, and then we'll speak about some of the gifts and the risks, I think, of being teachers in Catholic schools. I'd also then like to move on to some practical considerations rooted in our own Catholic anthropology. So if we're going to teach these human students, we should probably do that in a manner befitting of their nature. So if I really do just want to share some experiences, if I had to put it into an argument form, I would say it's something on the lines of this. If we intend to offer a civic education in a Catholic setting, then we must do so in a way that respects the Catholic anthropology and nature of our students. And we do this by respecting their freedom, by treating them as rational creatures capable of knowing, by protecting their capacity for language, and by employing the human being's love of story. Maybe more than anything else, by being aware of the fact that their hearts were made to be restless until they rest in God, and so to have a confidence that come what may, come what decisions, mistakes are made, the wins, the losses, all the rest of it, they will not be content until they rest in the destination that we all want them to reach. I'll begin by talking about, just definitions, like I said, civic education in this Catholic tradition of ours. So our tradition tells us that we should begin with definitions. Joseph Pieper, who's a philosopher who means a great deal to me and to many of us at the Heights, says that we should begin these conversations by querying linguistic usage. And so without hope of achieving false perfection, because it's tough with some of these phrases, I mean, talk about the liberal arts, define the liberal arts in one sentence. It's hard to do. But we'll do our best so that we can all play from the same sheet of music. As a preview of coming attractions, this precision in speech, of definitions and all the rest of it, is incredibly important for us as teachers, particularly with this cap, no cap, slay queen, straight fire generation that we're dealing with. We have to help them regain accuracy when they speak, because if they can't speak to each other, they can't engage in the beautiful art of politics, which is such a gift to our humanity. So let's get after it, as I say to my guys. What do we mean by education? I won't belabor a lot of these points because those are separate talks entirely, but in general, briefly, it's a leading out of. A leading out of what towards what? It's a leading out of ignorance towards knowledge, out of a lesser version of yourself into a fuller version of yourself, into mature Christian manhood as men and women who are fully alive. Joseph Pieper writes in Happiness and Contemplation, which is a brilliant book that I hadn't heard about until recently. We all know leisure, the basis of culture, but Happiness and Contemplation is awesome. No pun intended. But Pieper writes, man attains perfection insofar as the incomplete draft, which he is initially, is realized. And that's an image we can all get on board with, right? We deal with drafts and final papers. And so we get these students as 3-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 13-year-olds, whatever, and they're drafts of these beautiful final essays that they will someday become. There's two components to this leading out of ignorance. And these are components that I draw heavily from the liberal arts tradition itself. The first component is the training of the mind. And this is the quintessential teacher stuff that we do. This is the Robin Williams standing on the desk talking about poetry and literature and teaching math. So much of that is a part of the educational process, but not all of it. The second component of an education is the formation of character. What do we mean by character? Our headmaster at the Heights, Alvaro De Vicente, writes or says frequently that character is what you do when no one is looking. And I think I heard him say this the first time when I was in 8th grade. And so there were so many moments where late at night I was reaching into the cookie jar and nobody was looking. And of course I did it anyway and I took the cookie. But my conscience got me. Father James Shaw says that character is that particular combination of virtues and vices or habits that we have. And it also includes all the possible areas over which we should rule ourselves. So we don't have time today to get into the definitions of the virtues and the vices and all the rest of it, but I do think it's incredibly important for us to reflect on this aspect of education, the formation of our students' character. The training, why? Well, because training the mind without training the heart is a bad business. It's a very dangerous business. Mentorship in particular is important here. Right? What are we, many of us anyway? We are teachers. We're all educators, right? As friends, we educate our friends. We help our friends out of ignorance. We should be if we're good friends in the traditional sense. As parents, we're the primary educators of our children. It's an unbelievable blessing. As teachers, we're educators, but we're professional educators. We devote ourselves to this profession. As professional educators, I think we need to renew in ourselves a commitment to mentorship. Right, which is attending to of the character and the hearts of our students. It's so important here, especially also in this context where we're talking about civic education, because if we can't teach our students to rule themselves, how can we possibly expect them to rule others? Right, they have to have a dominion of themselves before they exercise dominion over their families, their cities, their states, their countries. What do we mean by ruling ourselves? Right, it sounds totalitarian, but really it's a means to freedom. It's to use our mind and our will to know and guide what is already in us or related to us so that we direct these powers to a proper purpose and to the end of their being. That's Father James Shaw in his incredible book, The Order of Things, which probably one of my top 3 if I had to pick 3 books for a younger me to read before the first day of class. Again, it's taking that rough draft and making it a final paper, but not just the mind, the heart as well. And this is kind of a nice transition point into the next piece of our definitional exercise, right? Not just what is education, but what is civic education. And so we've probably heard many of us John Adams quote as he's writing John Quincy, and he says, "You will ever remember that the end of education is to make you a good man and a useful citizen," right? So we've spoken about the good man bit. We can imply or infer the good woman bit. And of course, we go forward now to this useful citizen. What does that mean? So I think this gets at what it means to be a civic educator. So we can study civics in two ways. One is as a subject, and the other is as preparation for the practice of the art of politics. So as subject, it's a study of our own city, right? Our polis, our republic, our community, our nation, our government, our state. Each of these separate terms, by the way, needing a precise definition, or else really messy things can happen when people try to mix those definitions up and just kind of play with maps without understanding what the difference is between a state and a nation, or a community and a society, and all the rest of it. This is the study not only of all those things, but of our history, our laws, our Tocquevillian mores. In a lesser but really important way, maybe it's not lesser at all, it's also the study of our art and our culture. Because art shapes us, and insofar as it shapes us, it also shapes our city. And the city, of course, in turn shapes us. We heard last night that law teaches. I heard some instances and saw some instances of civic education as I was getting on the plane to come to this wonderful event. We're waiting in the jet bridge, and there's a long line, and there's a child trying to race up ahead, and the parents are calling the child back. And this wonderful father very patiently just starts peppering his, I think she must have been 2 years old, with questions just to try to keep her attention and keep her at his side. And he said, I think it was Amanda, what did Yankee Doodle ride on when he went to town? That's civic education, right? Those are the songs that bind us together. I looked up from this, just kind of chuckling at this really beautiful moment of education, of civic education, and I see a poster on the wall, and the poster says, "Time for some me time. You deserve it." That's civic education as well, right? What's the highest end? I don't think they were arguing for leisure. I think they were just arguing for this kind of like, just unplug and focus on yourself. That's civic education. So there's good civic education, there's bad civic education. It's the study of our culture, right? So all this goes into it. Flannery O'Connor defines culture as a mystery in manners. And there is, there's such a mystery behind the culture. It's the principles, the beliefs. What is the cult at the end of the day that's the basis of so much that we do, right? The eating of hamburgers on the 4th of July and the throwing of candy off of emergency service vehicles that are cruising through towns. There's reasons for all of this, right? So why? What are the principles that lead to these wonderful practices? As masterfully shown by George Weigel in his book, A Witness to Hope, it is so important for us to attend to our culture. Because ultimately, sometimes I think we're very quick to want to just jump into politics and just fix government and everything's going to be fine. But at the end of the day, John Paul II realized, I think he was right, that culture drives politics. Culture drives society. And very interestingly, ideas drive culture, which is why it's great to be here at a university where we study ideas so that we can go back to our schools, influence the culture, and then hopefully bring everybody closer towards their destined end. Obviously, there are lots of challenges in this project, right, of being professional educators who lead out of ignorance, in particular through this teaching or this pedagogy of civic virtue and all the rest of it. There are challenges to the training of the mind. I'm bullish on humanity and on Catholicism because Christ has risen. I don't know how it's going to end, but obviously I think we win at the end of the day. I do know that. But the risks are undeniable, whether it's the elimination of stories from curriculum, whether it's just the attempts to kind of just play with fundamental definitions that shouldn't be tampered with, or whether it's the general distrust of country that's really being deployed pretty systematically in schools across the U.S. One very interesting risk that I'm aware of, I teach the AP government class, and it's interesting. I can't help but love a scoreboard. I'm a little bit competitive, so having a scoreboard, I kind of like it. But this year it was interesting because of what happened to the scoring mechanisms, and they've really watered down the grades. They've inflated everything, so it's of such dubious value. But in other AP subjects as well, being aware of the really robust system of videos and multiple choice questions that now allow teachers across the United States to completely outsource the teaching of the content. And you don't really know who's actually teaching your kids if they're just watching videos every night. So it's something to be aware of. But that's a training of the mind. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. There's also civic education as the means to the end of good citizenship. And here it can be helpful to lean on Aristotle's distinctions between the few and the many. So for the many, all of our students will be citizens, all of them. It's kind of a shocking realization for me annually when I walk into class the first day and I see the guys, a couple of them with their shirts out, maybe somebody's late, somebody's kind of sitting sideways, somebody's got some gum, and it's good. It's like that's why we do what we do. We love this, right? That's why we're here. But as I see them in this class in particular, I realize, wow, these guys are going to be choosing the next president of the United States of America. It's amazing. So, of course, we hearken back to Mr. Franklin's exchange. Jeremy mentioned it. Ben Franklin, walking out of the drafting of the Constitution, encounters a citizen who's, everything was private. They were just locked into this very hot Constitution Hall in Philadelphia, and he's asked by a citizen, well, doctor, what have we got? Is it a republic or is it a monarchy? And he says, a republic, if you can keep it, right? So as teachers, we are keepers of the republic. Keepers of the keepers. Not only will our students all be voters, they're also going to be friends, right? And they're also going to be fathers, husbands, mothers, right? Friends, again, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, neighbors, all the rest of it. All of this is a politic. Preparation for all of that is politics. But friendships also in particular, right? I think friendship is such a key aspect of what it means to live in community. And Father James Shaw, in that book, The Order of Things, he writes that good friendships are ever the enemy of tyranny everywhere, right? So the tyrant, when he takes charge, one of the first things he wants to do is disrupt those networks of friendships. So we have to work hard to help our students learn how to make and keep those friendships. Again, here too, we think of John Paul II cruising around Krakow during the Nazi occupation, literally risking his life to get together with his friends to read poetry and to put on plays. It's really beautiful. Part of our job as teachers, and I'm quoting Dr. Gerard Wegemer in an amazing book he wrote called The Young Thomas More and the Arts of Liberty, which I commend to all of us if we're trying to understand how to define better the liberal arts. But he wrote a book. In it, he quotes Cicero extensively, as did More. But in this book, De Oratore by Cicero, Wegemer quotes Cicero here, "It is each person's duty to weigh well what are his own particular traits of character before choosing his role upon the stage of life. Only in this way can people work to the best advantage in that role to which they are best adapted, and therefore not falter in any discharge or duty." So what does that mean for us as teachers? We have to help our students, through mentorship, discern what it is that they're called for and what they're called to. And in particular, in this context, I don't think it's a bad thing to keep an eye out for who among our students might be made for some type of civic leadership, right? Whether in politics or in law, government, whatever it is. For this reason, and to kind of awaken the moral imagination that my students have, using that term that a headmaster uses, it comes from Russell Kirk's The Roots of the American Order. Right? We have to wake up the moral imagination of our students. But I will call them routinely. I won't say Mr. Smith and Mr. whoever else. I'll say, okay, Senator Smith, or Congressman Jones, Dr. Franklin, whatever, just to kind of shock them out of this realization. I think it's an interesting thing to be an adolescent, because at the end of the day, you go to school, you play your sports, and then you go home and you do a couple of chores, but you lose touch with the fact that a life really should have kind of purpose. What is your purpose in life right now? It's tough if it's just to take tests so you can go to college, right? But to kind of remind them, we can help them reform their moral imaginations to realize that they are called to great things. We don't want to treat this like Ender's Game, right, or like Gattaca, where we're sort of picking the elite and just taking them to a special place and training them there. It's not that, but it is helping them realize that many of them may be called to the very noble art of political leadership. And here too, right, for the few, not the many, I think we can lean on Thomas More as just an amazing example of a quintessentially useful Catholic citizen, well-versed in this highest of the practical sciences. Wegemer writes that Thomas More wrote a letter to his friend Erasmus in which he expresses his desire to be a princeps, right? This is a saint of the Catholic Church. And so we might say, okay, you know what, that's kind of lacking in humility, guy. Who are you to think that you should be the first citizen? But humility is not just kind of like this abasement of ourselves and constant beating of the chest. It's the virtue that allows us to have our feet firmly on the ground, right? To know our strengths, not only our weaknesses. And if some of our students have those strengths, we need to help them maximize on that. Who is this princeps? Etymologically, the princeps means the taking or the capturing of first place. There's a certain Republican fitness about this definition, right? It's okay to be really good and really virtuous. And we need the people who are most good and most virtuous to rule. That's what we would like. The princeps from More comes from Cicero's Principatus, the man who is responsible for steering the ship of state, right? So that's who we want at the helm of our state, are the most virtuous, the most well-trained, the most humble, right, in every sense of the word. Let's bring these images back. What does a princeps need? He needs good moral character, again, mentorship, including magnanimity, and a Ciceronian kind of contempt for wealth and the transitory human goods, good moral character. He needs an image of the good life, and this is part of where the liberal arts are so beautiful and helpful. What is a princeps supposed to do, right? He's supposed to foster the common good that allows us to live the best lives possible. How can he do that if he doesn't know what the best life is? Right? He has to have a sense, she has to have a sense of the destination that we're going to. So that's why Cicero and More both wrote about the importance of humanitas, the best way of life. What does it mean to be human? All of this. Very importantly, third and finally, the princeps must have mastery over those arts needed to govern the free. The arts of education, law, rhetoric, the liberal arts. The liberal arts. I would argue, I can't help but mention, it's interesting to see in this day and age how effective the liberal arts are in preparing our young people for college, for career, right? We don't want to back away from college and career just because that's become somebody else's standard. I think what we can say is that the liberal arts restored to themselves do that and so very much more. One interesting example has just been the whole AI space with, people are asked what the programming code of the future is, and really the future programming code is English. Mastery of the English language allows you to leverage ChatGPT and all the other AI tools to, with precision, to do exactly what you want them to. So literally a lot of the stuff that our third and fourth and fifth graders were studying in computer labs, I mean, in the end, it's going to be English. And I'm hearing that not from champions of the liberal arts, but for well-versed practitioners in the IT space. So anyway, we cannot give up on the existence of this person, of this Churchill, this Honest Abe Lincoln, this George Washington. They're out there. They might be in our classrooms. And so we've got to show up every day prepared to give them, the Margaret Thatchers, our very best. I think a huge obstacle to this may be a certain acedia or despair that can creep into our classrooms, right? Things are just so bad. Politics is just, it's all so broken. Let's just eat, it's a certain intellectual kind of just eat, drink, and be merry because tomorrow nothing else matters. And I would argue I don't think that's a position that's in our best interests as a polis, as a city, and I don't think it's in the best interests of our students' souls. So what do we mean by Catholic schools? Again, so we are professional educators. We're talking about civic education, the training of the mind, the formation of character, right? The teaching of the city, and also the preparation for civic leadership and politics. What do we mean by Catholic schools? Schools whose mission, either express or implied, is to introduce their students to the person of Jesus Christ and the way of life and love shepherded by his church. What are the advantages, the wonderful things that come to this from us? We have Jesus Christ, full stop. We also have the universality of knowledge, which is interesting. We have a reference point from which we can pull metaphysics into politics, or we can pull science or the empirical sciences, something like chemistry, physics, biology, into government. Right? We have a place where all of these subjects can rally together and speak to each other. That is a real benefit, a real advantage in a world that sees everything as just disaggregated molecules. I do think that there are some things that we should be cautious of as Catholic teachers in schools, particularly as we form citizenship. The first is a certain temptation. Well, let me back up. In the Catholic tradition and the intellectual tradition of the West, you have the vita activa and the vita contemplativa, right? The active life and the contemplative life. And really the active life is good, but it's not the highest purpose of what it means to be human, right? To be a human means to, at its fullness, means to contemplate. We introduce Christianity to that, and it means to contemplate God ultimately in the beatific vision, right? So why do we work? We work because work is good, but also because work allows us to have a community where we can contemplate. Okay, so a couple of temptations. One is a temptation to withdraw from the vita activa. There are some things that are not going all that great right now, admittedly. But I think that, to say, well, there's nothing we can do, right? Goodbye, world. I'm going to go off and cogitate and contemplate. I think that is a mistake. And that, to me, looks a bit like Eeyore. And though we are made, in the end, right, we're made for contemplation, make no mistake about it. That's why we're here. That's heaven. And the kingdom of heaven, by the way, starts here and now on earth. We're made for contemplation, but the active life can absolutely be sanctified, right? You can be a Thomas More in political office. I like to remind my students, and occasionally my daughters as well, that John Smith, right, when he first landed in Jamestown, everybody was dying from starvation. And what does John Smith do? He makes a new rule. He says, listen, you English nobles, that doesn't fly here. He who does not work, neither shall he eat. Right, so we have to work. It's part of a vocation. God puts Adam and Eve on the planet, and he says, go, crescite, make it grow, plant, harvest, enrich. Right, so not only can this work be sanctified, but also, we need people to do this work to protect our rights and freedoms to contemplate. Right, if we give up on the active life, then we just might lose that contemplative privilege, which is such an important part of our humanity. In short, I would say, the good Lord said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. He didn't say, stop paying your taxes, right? We have to continue to care for this political order. There's a beautiful line in a book by the title of Peace Like a River. And in this book, there's an amazing father who's taking his children through some really difficult circumstances, difficult times. And something bad happens. I won't give it away. Please read it. It's beautiful. But this wonderful, virtuous, self-possessed, strong, but patient father looks at his children in a difficult moment, and his children are kind of bemoaning their lot in life. And he says, we and the world, my children, will always be at war. Retreat is impossible. Arm yourselves. From a prayerful man to his children. It's a beautiful line. The second temptation that I think exists for us as Catholics is a temptation to direct our entire vita activa effort towards a sort of non-existent utopia. And I'm so grateful for Professor George's comments last night. They were really, really helpful. I have a friend from Spain, a dear friend from Spain, who visits often, and he always, he calls it like he sees it, like the good Spaniard that he is. But whenever he visits D.C., he says things like, you guys are so obsessed with politics. And before we can talk about the weather, before we can talk about a piece of art or whatever, you guys all just have to agree that everything's terrible and the end is near, unless your candidate wins, in which case everything will be fine, and then you can talk about the weather. And he says it's tough. It can be tough to go to parties here. I was like, oh, sorry. So I think there's a tendency, there can be a risk towards a certain utopianism, right? Which can itself be maybe a mild flavor of an ideology. As it's easy to kind of malign the progressive movement by saying, well, listen, these are people who love humanity but hate Peter and Paul, right? To kind of lean on that image from Tocqueville. They love the image, the idea of humanity that we're going to remake in our own image, but I don't have to give this poor person a glass of water. It's easy to malign progressives for doing that, but in a certain sense, that can creep into our consciousness as well. And I love riffing on politics like the best of them. I'm in Washington, D.C. I love D.C. Something about traffic, I kind of enjoy it. I'm like, look at all these people getting to Capitol Hill to do the things that they do. It's great. And I can be a big complainer, but I've got to remind myself to put not my trust in princes, like yesterday's psalm said. Father James Shaw, again, in his wonderful book, The Order of Things, writes, man is a political animal, but also something more. Thus, we find admonitions in Revelation both to worship God alone and to give our neighbor in need a cup of water. Right, so as we are engaging in this vita activa, which we must, because it's not good in itself, but it is a good, right, that also leads to the good in itself of contemplation. We need to protect our capacity for contemplation. As we're doing that, we can't give in to this temptation to just sort of see politics as God, right? And we heard this from this year's Eucharistic Congress, that politics is not God. Again, do not put your trust in princes. So given all of this, the question might be phrased as follows. How do we as teachers, i.e. professional educators, As Catholic educators, right, and I think some of us might not be at Catholic schools. So as Catholic educators, either at Catholic schools or elsewhere, where maybe you have to change your language a little bit, but you can do much of the same thing without using the fullness of the language, but still the fullness of the concepts, matters and differences in maybe in degree, but not in kind. All right, let me back up. How, as professional educators, as teachers, do we educate, meaning to train the mind, form the character, in the civic tradition, right, of teaching our children about the city while also preparing them for leadership, while rooting that experience in the person of Jesus Christ, but avoiding the disdain of the vita activa and also the acedia that can lead to a certain utopianism. How do we do this? The answer, as I said earlier, I think is both practical but also rooted in a certain theory of human anthropology informed by the Catholic tradition, right? We should treat these beautiful little creatures launching spitballs and talking in class and firing the Tweeties, although they don't really do that anymore. They used to. I don't know if you guys did that when you were growing up. The rubber band and the alligator. Anyway, you see that stuff, right, in class. How we should treat them in a manner befitting their nature, right? We can't just kind of have these ideas that we want to cram into their brains. We have to think about who they are. We have to contemplate them and then educate them in a manner befitting of their nature. It's such an important part of our job as professional educators to be contemplatives and to pray. That's what we got to pray, and to pray about our students so we know how to teach them. Here's some really just practical pointers rooted in my own experience. Again, my soil is not your soil. The crops I'm growing are not the crops you're growing. But here's some things that tend to work for us in our tradition, rooted in the anthropology. First, our students are made for freedom. And so we have to educate them in freedom. If we are raising them to be citizens of a free city, then we have to give them some freedom now. And we got to be careful because oftentimes freedom is complicated and it's messy, right? And it's not convenient. And you lose order. There's a couple examples that come to mind for me. In my work as admissions director, I love seeing the first impressions of students who are visiting the Heights for their visit days and all the rest of it. And on days where snow is falling, the kids bring their sleds in. The kids throw snowballs. They engage in massive, massive snowball wars, and it's incredible. I was talking to one young man who was visiting, and I said, what do you think of the Heights? And he said, I think it's really cool. You don't have to do any sneak attacks. I said, what's a sneak attack? He said, well, in my school, we're not allowed to touch the snow when it snows. And so we all get together, and every once in a while, we can kind of talk, and all the teachers are looking elsewhere, and we reach out and touch the snow. It sounds like Shawshank Redemption. It's interesting. The snow is there, in part, to be thrown, right? It was given to us to be molded into projectiles that we can use to have epic battles, right? That's the purpose of snow. Another young man came, and he said he came from a school where, and I know the school is beautiful green space all around it, but they're only permitted to be on the blacktop because otherwise they kill the grass. If they want to run, because the blacktop is limited in space, they can only run in one direction on the outside of the blacktop counterclockwise, right? So it's interesting the things that we do to ensure our students are learning to be free, right, in the classroom, the books they read and all the rest of it. But then we got to ask ourselves, what is the experience of the student outside the classroom, right? Is he experiencing freedom outside the classroom, and are we okay with them making mistakes with that freedom? Because I tell you what, some of the biggest lessons I learned were after mistakes, right? Where I had a good mentor or my incredibly patient parents kind of say, all right, let's run that one back, Rich. What are you going to do different next time, right? So mistakes are okay. I think that the ultimate civic education for many of our students can happen at recess. I had a parent, I was giving a tour, and the parent asked, how do you teach civic responsibility? How do you teach executive functioning? And I look around and I see this flurry of activity where the kids are playing, and they're building forts and they're attacking each other's forts, and they're playing dodgeball and somebody tags second, playing kickball and somebody tags second, somebody else says you were out, no I wasn't, right? And you see the compromise. You see the negotiation, you see the sacrifice, you see the courage, you see the friendship, you see friendships going through difficult times. You were out. No, I wasn't. You were out. You see resolution, conflict resolution, right? This is all at recess. So again, there's so much freedom that we can offer our children outside of the classroom. It's important to be attentive to that. I'd also I'm not going to go off on this, but just parenthetically, it is interesting, the amount of physical freedom that we are willing to give our children, i.e. very little, relative to the amount of digital freedom that we are willing to give our children, i.e. very, very much. Our headmaster says he would rather put an 8th grader on a plane to Las Vegas for the weekend. He'd rather do that than give an 8th grader an unfiltered iPhone, or even a filtered one. iPhones are tricky. So just we have to be attentive to that so much of what we do in the classroom can be completely undone by a screen. So the second aspect of our students' anthropology that I would tend to, so we are free creatures. We're also rational creatures, right? We're made in God's image, and so we have the ability to reason, to bring into our mind everything that is. It's kind of a cool thing to be a human being. So to protect this capacity for reason, a couple of thoughts. One, we have to protect language. We have to embrace the beauty of the word, both written and spoken. Because without the word, again, in the civic context, we can't talk to each other, right? How can we have a constructive conversation today pick a random person from New York City or Topeka or Seattle? How can we have a good conversation with them without coming to an agreement about what things like equality mean, or justice, or freedom, or liberty, or democracy, right? So we have to give our children a capacity for the spoken word, both written and spoken. With regard to the spoken word, I'd say my encouragement is, y'all, let's keep being really annoying. By that I mean, you get the question from the student who says, Mr. Moss, can I go to the bathroom? And I say, I'm sure you can. You're the worst. May I go to the bathroom? No, Mr. Smith, you may not. You may go to break. So just demanding that precision in their language, right? Can versus may. Like this, like that. I mean, I use filthy fillers like the rest of them, as you've all heard today. But we can encourage each other. We can encourage our students to cut like out of their vocabulary as much as possible. We can encourage them to use precision in speech. Nation versus state, there's a difference. Community versus society, there's a difference. Again, democracy versus democratic republic, there's a difference, a big difference. With the written word, we can demand excellence. This is an interesting time with ChatGPT, which is getting better and better and better and better. I think the brief hiatus of kind of being able to tell when something's written by ChatGPT and when it's not it's quickly ending, right? So this is a place for us to talk and share ideas and compare notes, maybe err more on the side of in-class assignments, but what we cannot do is give up on this incredible pedagogy, art of the written word. We need to preserve that, and so now we got to be creative, which is actually kind of fun. I think we should also bring back Latin and Greek. We should continue to do that. Bishop Varden, who's the Bishop of Trondheim, Norway, and writes beautifully about a number of things, but he writes, I think the book is The Shattering of Loneliness. He says that speaking only one language is a form of totalitarianism, right? Because your concept of the thing, the water bottle or the computer or the country or the person is entirely shaped by all the baggage that your cultural context has put into this word. But expanding your vocabulary into different languages also expands your ability to approach these concepts, right? So, speaking about desire versus longing, for example, in English, versus deseo in Spanish, or querer, or all the rest of it. I would add to Bishop Varden, if I might do so very humbly, that it's not just a form of totalitarianism to speak one language, it's also totalitarianism to speak one language from one time, which is where Greek and Latin factor into this, right? We need to reach deeper in our tradition. I say this as a guy who, as Dr. Yusesko knows, my Latin is terrible, but I know that I want my kids to be better than me, and so I'm demanding that they dive into this beautiful language. We're asked to give to this next generation something we didn't get, right? And so that's going to take grace, but I think it's doable. Finally, I encourage us to help our students embrace reality, right? We are free, we are rational, and we are made to use that reason to capture reality. Walker Percy has a beautiful essay that my colleague Michael Moynihan writes about. The essay is Loss of the Creature, and it talks about the first Spaniards, a guy named Descartes, I think, who's cruising across the American West, and he stumbles across the Grand Canyon. Can you imagine stumbling across the Grand Canyon, finding that as if for the first time, right? Can you imagine seeing that when nobody else even knew that it existed, except for all the people who were there before him? It'd be a remarkable experience. Today, you go to the Grand Canyon, right, and you pull up in the driveway, you park in the parking spot that you've probably reserved online in advance, and you go to Bright Angel Lodge, you go up to the barrier, you turn around, you snap a selfie, and you cruise back in your car, and you're out. That is a mediated experience of a very beautiful reality, right? And so our job as teachers, as professional educators, is to try to help our students as much as we can, right, because you can't obviously discover the Grand Canyon for the first time now, but as much as we can to try to help them confront realities as if for the first time themselves, right, to see things as if with brand new eyes, like it's never been seen before. I think there's really important reasons to do this. One reason is that not doing this conditions them to put all their trust in experts, right? So I will do what the experts tell me to do because, well, they're experts, right? Whatever the textbook says is whatever is true, right? And I think a couple of places where I've seen this to be really interestingly true now. One, the really wonderful, really helpful, really thoroughly unsurprising book by Jonathan Haidt on the anxious generation. Did we really need a social scientist to tell us that unfettered internet access is somehow bad for children? Did we really need that? Right? Why are legislatures all across the country now all of a sudden taking notice? Well, it's because an expert said so. Like, oh, forgive me, we have an expert. Right? And so I'm grateful to him for having written the book. We needed that, obviously. Right? We've been catalyzed into action across the country. But I don't think that we as parents, as teachers, as educators, as sovereign knowers ourselves of our children, I don't think we needed that. Right? It's helpful to make the argument. The other one, obviously this is kind of hollowed, sensitive ground, but I think it's important for us to reflect on what happened in 2020, right, with the pandemic, which caused immeasurable suffering and death and difficulty for the entire world. It was a terrible time. I will say it's interesting to ponder how school systems responded to the pandemic, right? And in D.C., Montgomery County, schools closed down to in-person learning for, months and months, close to a year in many cases. And nobody questioned anything. It was just basically, we will do what the experts say. So the Heights took a different tack, still being cautious and prudential, right? You can't cast prudence out. You've got to be prudent always. But it was shocking to be so alone in that time. And I think that this disposition, this capacity, comes from an approach to epistemology where I don't necessarily need to rely on somebody else to interpret everything for me. I am a sovereign knower. Our students are sovereign knowers. And so as teachers, it's not just about teaching them stuff, right? Filling their minds with stuff. It's about helping them become human beings who trust their own capacity to know. Such an important gift. In this regard, I encourage us to lean on stories, right? Reading the great stories, on memorization, right? So they internalize those things and tools that they can take forward with them. I think we need to be cautious with textbooks, truly. Textbooks are interesting. I teach U.S. government, and it was just, I was chuckling. I think I was sharing last night. We were talking about the Establishment Clause and the Lemon Test in my class. And right there in the page, it's asking the boys to memorize the Lemon Test, right? Which helps judges decide whether or not there's been an improper, unconstitutional establishment of religion. Problem is that was overruled last year. The Lemon Test is no more. And I love that example because it was case in point for my boys just to show them, listen, not everything you see in the textbooks is true. But even for those things that aren't necessarily not true, simply being true now doesn't mean they will be true forever, right? And so there's other doctrines, other cases that we talk about where I tell the students there's a risk to studying for the AP exam. And the risk is that you are studying all these things as if they will be true until kingdom come. And it's not the case, right? Plessy versus Ferguson is no more, right? Roe versus Wade is no more. Things can change, right? Things can be amended. New cases can come down when you guys and gals reach the Supreme Court. I'd say we have to be demanding of our students. We can ask that they read the great books, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, More, Seneca, Cicero, etc. Our kids can handle it. And I'm convinced that I think we can bring education back to a point where 200 years ago, all the guys and gals are reading these in the native language, in Latin and Greek. That's what our founding fathers did. So I think we can get there. I know we need to move on, so I will stop. I could keep going forever because I love what I do and I love sharing what I do with you. I do think we need to have we are rational beings. We have a capacity for language to embrace reality. I think we are made fundamentally, our anthropology is for God. So we have to have a trust that our students will be restless until they rest in the Lord. And that should give us some confidence. It should give us some confidence when they make mistakes. It should give us some confidence when we see them doing things well. It should give us some confidence to not have to completely bubble wrap them and protect them, right? We want to filter culture, but if you keep somebody, I think I have a son who, from his youngest days, he couldn't see very well, and so his way of interacting with reality was through his mouth. So like shoes and just everything went in his mouth. The kid never got sick, ever. Right? And so if the first time our children are encountering things from the popular culture is when they're in college at 18, away from us as parents, that doesn't always end well, right? So we want to filter the culture, but we also don't want to bubble wrap our kids, because at the end of the day, we want them to be those princeps, those leaders who step into the broader society and, by God's grace, keep this